Welcome to Finding the Warmth for Our Sun. I'm Matthew Broggen. I'm going to be your host. Today we're going to be covering a woefully incomplete history of racial violence targeting Black Americans in the United States. Now, not only is this history incomplete when it comes to racial violence targeting Black Americans in the United States, it's incomplete of racial violence within the United States. This is a really widespread topic where we even see it in the context of our immigrant populations today, primarily Latino, but let's not forget there are Black, Latinos to Afro-Latino populations that are impacted by this, with our kids being housed in cages and families being broken apart and the absolutely horrific conditions of these ICE detention facilities. We need to defund ICE, which is an extremely, put it plainly, fascist organization. They are committing human rights violations after human rights violations, right? So this can really inform actually a lot of the lens that we can see a lot of racial violence within the United States, even outside of those caused on Black Americans. And that is this violence. Well, most people that accosted it didn't face any consequences. And it's almost always seen as justified, particularly in the face of the other, in this context, Black Americans, being seen as inherently criminal, right? The myth of Black criminality. Well, these crimes, those that accost the violence, those criminals aren't seen as criminals, whether it be through their own eyes or in a lot of ways through the history. And again, very few have actually seen any consequences of such, be it from the government or civilian actions. And I think that is important to see, particularly as we walk through how these things impact today. And let's think about Trayvon Martin and his killing, right? Where most of white America was far more willing to sympathize with George Zimmerman than they were with Trayvon Martin. Where Trayvon Martin was a kid walking by himself in his neighborhood, being stalked in a car by a man, being followed, didn't know who this guy was, and chose to defend himself when this guy got out of the car following him again. Yet white Americans found it easier to feel that Zimmerman was justified in the stalking, that this kid didn't belong, right? And the fact that staying your ground, that mentality of defending yourself, was not able to be adopted in their viewpoint by Trayvon, but Zimmerman instead, who again stalked this kid. Stalked him with a gun. Yet again, they're able to sympathize with Zimmerman or Trayvon. Justified violence. And with stand your ground laws, the vast majority of people that it's applied to are white. It doesn't appear to apply to Black people. Again, this, what we justify, what we don't. And again, this is a book on the law. Like, it's very hard for stand your ground to be successfully applied to Black Americans in trial. Those are the facts. So we must look at this, and even something as simple as with my parents, with my mom being white, my dad being Black, facing everyday violence, what seems simple, right, and small compared in the context of these things, is the fact that they had lit cigarettes flicked at them at a baseball game, being a mixed race couple. You know, that's violence in of itself. It's terror. It's humiliation. All right. Most Black Americans have a story of the threat of violence, humiliation, particularly at the hands of police or other white people, where their lives are very much at stake, and if they didn't submit, they might die. Right. Some didn't submit and lived. Some didn't submit and died. Others submitted and lived, others submitted and died. So this history of racial violence goes all the way up through the present day. So let's start walking through with it. Again, these lynchings and these actions were justified by one, not seeing Black Americans as truly Americans, as legitimately Americans, right? We saw that even with Barack Obama, and we're seeing it with Kamala Harris right now, right? Regardless of where you view, your politics, I'm to the left of them and can be very critical, but the fact they haven't been seen as truly American, right? So who are the true Americans? As well as Black criminality or the myth of Black criminality has been used to justify this violence, right? This isn't ancient history. There's people that live this today. There's people who lived it in the past. Their family lived it. My own family's been impacted by it through lynchings and other types of violence as well, right? This is very real. This is very lived. There are people that have alive that have survived lynchings. There are people it's the list goes on. And I'm also not going to be covering this, violence of chattel slavery, which needs its own really episode. There are some real distinctions between chattel slavery and historical slavery, where historical slavery we might see more akin, not exactly one-to-one, but more akin to what we recognize as indentured servitude. Chattel slavery was unique and different in exactly what it was, right? So we'll have its own episode within exploring the differences in the history of slavery and that kind of violence. So we're going to be looking at really post-Civil War. So let's jump into it, right? Again, woefully incomplete. We're going to be doing some time skips and so much more going on, but this helps get a picture, right? So in 1866, the Louisiana Constitutional Convention, ex-Confederates, police officers, and white folks in general attacked Black Republicans in New Orleans. They killed any women, kids, and any Black person they could find. 238 people were killed, most of whom were Black. 1868. Leading up to the election that year, there's an estimate that Pulaski, Tennessee, the KKK committed 1,300 murders. That same year, St. Bernard Parish, Louisiana, white Democrats dragged somewhere between 35 and 200 Black people from their homes and killed them to prevent them from voting. Same year in South Carolina, over 1,500 people were killed to prevent from voting. Again in 1868, in Georgia, 30 Black state representatives, 3 Black state senators were elected. Using violence and intimidation, all 33 were removed from office. 25 of those elected officials were jailed, beaten, or shot. The Georgia Supreme Court ruled that they had no right to hold office because they had African blood in their veins. During a protest march to the Republican convention, they hired 400 armed guards on the 25-mile march. They came to a town where the sheriff armed and deputized its entire white population. When the Black marchers arrived, they were massacred. This set off weeks of white militia roaming the countryside, killing and lynching any Black person they felt as a threat to vote. Again, this deputizing white population, right? Again, we see this with the Beckys, and particularly white women in general, and white people in general. And this is particularly the case with Trayvon, of policing Black bodies and saying, you don't belong where you are. As well as the seeing of the Black American as not legitimately American, not the true American. Only the true American is the white American in this type of mentality. And again, we see this, right? And some of it's coded, and some of this we don't even know when we talk about the implication that we see a lot of politicians talk about with the working class, right? They erase Black and brown working class. They only see the white American, the true American, as the working class. That's kind of erasure. That's this mentality that we have to beat back of who is the true American. In 1870, the Kirk Holden War. North Carolina Governor Holden hired a former U.S. Civil War general, General Kirk, to battle the KKK and their wave of terror. Eventually, after the fighting died down, Holden was impeached and tried after white Southern Democrats took power as a backlash, right? During the fall's election. 1874, 5,000 members of mostly Confederates called the White League removed the Republican Louisiana governor in the Battle of Liberty Place. Eventually, federal troops came and they retreated. No member of this group was charged with any crime. 1876, due to widespread ballot stuffing and cheating, a group of 15 congressmen effectively decided that presidential election. I should say in South Carolina alone, 101% of eligible voters were represented. In this compromise, President Hayes had to remove federal troops from the South, and it officially launched the Jim Crow era. This effectively was particularly white Northerners, right? Let's move past political parties, because in another episode I'll get into the political realignments and the changes and the shifts of our currently our two major political parties. At this point, though, in 1876, the Republican Party effectively abandoned being the party of civil rights. There was no party of civil rights until really the 1960s. And they found it more advantageous to realign themselves with the Southern white aristocrats and landowners and property owners under the threat, again, of a new civil war than they did to really maintain the freedom of Black Americans, who were struggling at this point, right? And facing a lot of violence. So they threatened more violence and this wave of terror. And the lynchings and the terror didn't stop at this point. It continued through. But we're going to jump ahead a little bit, and I hope in another episode really to cover and dive deep into Reconstruction and the legacy of Reconstruction, how it's and these institutions, mentalities, and directly tie them to today. There's a lot there to dive into. But we'll jump ahead a little bit. 1919 with the Red Summer, of over 250 Black Americans were killed during race riots all across the country. These race riots were spurred by Black soldiers coming home from World War I, proudly wearing their uniforms and defending this country, expected to be treated as human, but they weren't. Soldiers were lynched in their uniforms. 1921, Tulsa race riot. A white woman was scared of a black man trying to enter an elevator and screamed. This ended up launching a riot that killed, with low-end estimates of 250 Black people, higher ends over 1,000, displaced over 10,000 Black Americans. And this was the biggest center of wealth of Black America, fully independent economically. No money was being lended from, to, or by white people. And these were Black bankers, business owners. And they didn't owe any money to white institutions. To recoup any money that they lost during this, they became indebted to white banks. And this Black wealth was lost. Now, I'm not one to believe Black capitalism will save us, but this is just another example of robbery, right? I should also add at this point in the 1921 Tulsa race riots, the U.S. Army Air Corps, before the Air Force was officially formed as its own entity, ended up dropping bombs on Tulsa. It wasn't the last time that official agents of the state would be bombing Black Americans. In 1932 to 1972, this violence wasn't only just white mobs and lynching. It was medical, and by the U.S. government as well. The Tuskegee experiment, a U.S. study on syphilis using Black men. These men had syphilis, were never informed of their diagnosis, and instead they're being told they were being treated for bad blood. Bad blood ended up being the leading cause of death for Black Americans in the South during this period of time. None of them were treated for syphilis. And it's just really to study the progression of it. Black Americans were often used as guinea pigs for medical treatment. A lot of medical history is steeped in experimenting on Black people, particularly Black women. Gynecology is rooted on Black woman experimentation. And a lot of it was done without anesthetics. Again, there's a myth that Black people feel less pain, and that is hold true to today. The majority of doctors believe Black people have higher pain tolerance than white people. In 1963, Sunday, September 15th, 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. 4 Black girls died. The men responsible talked openly about it, and it took until 1977 before the first person to be charged with this crime. 1972, it came to public light of forced sterilization of women across the United States. Most of these women were Black. The total numbers across the United States aren't even known. Some states did keep records. Between 1933 and 1973, North Carolina sterilized over 5,000 Black women. From 1972 to 1981, Chicago police tortured over 100 Black people to force confessions. In 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped a bomb made of C4 from a helicopter on the Move housing compound. 5 children were killed between the ages of 7 to 13. Police told the fire department not to put out the fire, claiming they were scared Move would fire on them. Only when the compound was burned out did they enter. Non-police eyewitnesses say the shootout was massively one-sided, in which the vast majority of the gunfire came from Philadelphia PD. In 2015, a Guardian investigation report came out detailing an off-the-books Chicago Police Department detention facility that practiced, quote-unquote, enhanced interrogation, also known as torture techniques, that the CIA pioneered in Iraq. They would detain people completely off the books, no paper trail, no lawyers, and torture them. The U.S. Department of Justice, at this time headed by Eric Holder, shut it down, but not a single person was charged or held accountable for this operation. Not by Chicago, not by the state of Illinois, or by the United States federal government. In 2017, the white woman who claimed Emmett Till flirted with her and led to his brutal killing admitted she lied about the claim, and she has not faced any legal repercussions after this admission. And a lot of this stuff, again, predicated on Black criminality, right? So let's think about this even more on Black criminality. A Nixon advisor revealed in a 1994 interview that the drug war was explicitly launched to target Black Americans, especially civil rights and Black power leaders, as well as what they might have dubbed the radical left. Reagan took this and really expanded upon it, more particularly the war. So this next bit is going to come from Stamped from the Beginning by Idris Kendi. And put specifically under the context of Reagan's drug war, right? In 2012, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health found that white youths were 32% more likely than Black youths to sell drugs. But Blacks were far more likely to be arrested. The National Household Survey on Drug Abuse reported drug use among whites and Blacks were the same at 6.4%. Now, during the crack epidemic, it was found white and Blacks were selling and using crack at similar rates, yet Black folks were getting arrested at a far higher rate. It was found in 1996 when 2/3, or really 66% of crack users were white or Latino. 84.5% of the defendants convicted of crack were Black. He goes on to say, wherever there are more police, there are more arrests. And wherever there are more arrests, people perceive there is more crime, which then justifies more police and more arrests, and supposedly more crime. A study of violent crime from 1976 to 1989, that when controlling for employment factors, violent crime rate disparities disappeared. Violent crime appears higher in Black neighborhoods because of the concentration of unemployment. Black people aren't inherently more criminal, aren't inherently more violent, but instead face more, really, oppression, less chances of employment, less chances of building material wealth. Again, these crime rates have been used to justify brutal practices of racial oppression, be it stop and frisk, broken window policing, beatings and killings, just as they were with lynchings. These crime stats with lynchings were used to justify. Woodrow Wilson and other presidents looked at them and said, well, of course, this is, basically looked as these lynchings again as justify the brutal fights taken to the federal government to try and prevent and stop this wave of terror, but it didn't happen because they looked at these lynchings in a way of justify. They looked at Black criminality as the problem, right? Not the lack of economic opportunity as a problem. And they didn't see the violence being caused upon them as actual real violence, as justified violence in a way, right? And we don't look at the robbing of material wealth from housing to employment, to this incarceration and these police as violent. Well, in a lot of ways, they're inherently violent, psychologically violent, and traumatizing too. Lest we forget, particularly in the context of the drug war, with Iran-Contra, the CIA operatives, and this was known to at least at that time Vice President of the United States George Herbert Walker Bush, was supplying cocaine to Freeway Rick Ross, who became the nation's largest crack dealer during the 1980s due to this connection. Minimal accountability was held to any government official involved. Beyond just the legal arms, they knew cocaine was being supplied from a CIA operative to Freeway Rick Ross, being sold to support these illegal arms deals and the brutal dictators of brutal Contras and as well as Iran and the Iran-Iraq war. Like, it was a big whole mess, right? During the height of the drug war, no one was held accountable. Again, the drug war carries on today. We still justify and criminalize these things, right? Holistically, and let's say between 1865 and 1950, over 6,500 Black people were lynched. I should say known lynched. Or 2,000 we know were lynched during the era of Reconstruction. Lynchings didn't stop in 1950. These are what we know. And this doesn't account for all the other racial and mob violence, right? These are what we might just lynchings. Again, we know 475,000 families were displaced in the first 20 years of building the federal interstate system. Displacement of housing is, in a way, a form of violence. Imagine being forced to get up and move somewhere else and ghettoize somewhere else. We did this with our indigenous nations. We do this with Black and poor folk in a lot of ways. It's a form of colonization, a form of violence. So as we really, again, this is incomplete stuff. So as we work through all of this, let's try and really look at our history and our operations and how we do things in a different light, and on how we choose to justify certain violence, or how you choose to look at these certain things. Of course, if somebody behaved this way or that way, or maybe you're looking at even just Black crime without thinking about material conditions and the types of oppression and violence that the lack of access to real opportunity creates. Or you're looking at policing, right? So you want to end gun violence, yet we have all this police already. What do you propose that isn't effectively another form of violence to end this? We know policing hasn't ended it. When we look at the history of the United States and think about your own schooling and education, how many of these things did you actually learn about? Or did you skip through a lot of it? When you explored Reconstruction, did you really explore the violence that were in it? Or even the Civil War, not Civil War, but Civil Rights Movement. I explored a lot of violence in the Civil Rights Movement that were costed upon Black Americans. The Civil Rights Movement wasn't peaceful. It was violent. When we look at the hoses, the dogs, the beatings, that's violence, right? But we look at it as peaceful? I don't know. So we need to rethink and or just really readjust of how we look at these things. It can be scary to look at because of what it says about this country and maybe what it might say about you, right? It can be embarrassing to realize these things. It can be, the cognitive dissonance of it all, right? Of opportunities you might have afforded, the love you have for this country, the myths of this country, right? Of history that you should be proud of that maybe we shouldn't. And maybe we're not upholding the right people that we should be proud of, right? These are challenging topics that we'll continue to work through in Finding the Warmth of Our Sun. You can catch me every Wednesday here at Madison 365. You subscribe to a YouTube channel or on iTunes for, their podcasts or Apple Casts, whatever, or Stitcher and Spotify. So again, thank you. I'm your host, Matthew Browngen. And join us every week to cover these hard topics, sometimes much more in depth, a lot of times connecting to each other. But we'll continue to talk about them and hopefully lend some sort of enlightenment to where we are and hopefully where we can make things better. Thanks for joining us and have yourself a good day.
This is 365 Media.